And I'm very pleased to say welcome to John Naughton, Emeritus Professor of the Public Understanding of Technology at the Open University, and also Director of the Press Fellowship Program at Wolfson College, University of Cambridge. So John, we look forward to hearing about understanding and misunderstanding technology, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I should say that I'm coming in trepidation to this because I inhabit a parallel universe, I think. I'm not a scholar in this field. And as I was saying to Helle a few minutes ago, I've watched with admiration from the sidelines her commitment to cultural rights and the progress that this has made over the number of years since I've first heard her talk about it. What I do, I'm an engineer and a newspaper columnist, and what I do is I've worked for about 20 years on the implications of the internet for society and in particular for democracy. And we now have a new Center for Technology and Democracy in CRASSH, which is the institute in which gloknos is also located. So that's where I work. And one other thing, following on from Yvonne's talk, I suppose I should say, as full disclosure, that I'm talking to you from a sovereign state that is now actively contemplating breaking international law. And the full dimensions of that, the full implications of that, I think are probably not still widely appreciated. But anyway, that's where we are at the moment. And it kind of underpins to some extent my, I don't know, my skepticism about some of the conversations we have at the moment about things like this. Anyway, what I'm going to suggest is I'm going to put out a few propositions which I hope are worth discussing, and I hope to be refuted and disagreed with in the process. But anyway, what I'm going to suggest is that in terms of the understanding both of science and of technology, the experience we've had so far with COVID-19 makes for an interesting case study, because I think it's a great illustration of the ways in which the networked information ecosystem that we now inhabit interacts with the communication understanding of science as well as the understanding of technology in interesting ways. I'm speaking primarily from the UK experience, although, of course, much of what we have experienced here in terms of state incapacity and administrative incapacity has been reflected on steroids in the United States. And indeed, it may have happened in other countries, but from where we sit, from where I sit anyway, I think that many other jurisdictions have handled this much better. And the difficulties that we have here have been partly to do with our strange and dysfunctional political system, and partly to do with the incapacity of a state that's been bled dry over 40 years by outsourcing and neoliberal economic policies and so on. But two things in particular have struck me in the context of this particular discussion about science. The first is the strange business of face masks, because in that case, you may remember that at the beginning of this pandemic, many people, lay people, wondered if face masks might be a sensible precaution to adopt themselves. And they were doing that partly not because they knew much about the science or indeed anything about the science, but they had simply observed that in other countries, mostly in the Far East, where societies had effectively dealt with this kind of crisis before, that it was very customary for people to wear face masks in public. But but in the United Kingdom, it was also noticeable that when Cambridge used to be a tourist spot in the pre-pandemic days, we often noticed that tourists from China and Japan would often wear face masks, and they were widely regarded by the indigenous population with amazement. But when the pandemic struck, there started to be vigorous discussions in public and certainly on social media about whether or not face masks might be a good idea. And the interesting thing about that is that the scientific establishment at the time, in the form of the secretive advisory board of scientists supposedly advising the UK government and elsewhere, was, well, you know what, we don't have any kind of peer-reviewed evidence that suggests that face masks are any good. And this went on for quite a while. And watching it as a detached observer, I came to the conclusion that in this context, more wisdom was being displayed on Twitter than it was in the entire assembled British scientific establishment advising the government. And I thought that was a very interesting, I thought it was an interesting thought at the time. And guess where we are now? Everybody's supposed to be wearing face masks. Even the most eminent government scientists with knighthoods wear face masks. Now, that may be simply a measure of the way in which our understanding of the virus has progressed over a period of many months. But I was very struck by the way in which, as it were, established scientific expertise was ranged pretty forcefully against what would have seemed to have been a sensible and reasonable precaution. And it made me, it enabled me to understand why peer-reviewed science, as valorized by the scientific community generally, and I suppose the political establishment generally, is not entirely sacrosanct in the minds of the public. And then the second case that interested me in that respect was the way in which the understanding of our imperfect understanding of the virus and indeed of the epidemic shifted over time. Because you may recall when it started, it was first of all a kind of pneumonia. And then in the early stages here in the UK, it was certainly spread by droplets. And so the entire country embarked on a frenzied campaign of scrubbing every surface and cleaning every doorknob and so on. And the idea that it might have been perhaps more effectively spread by aerosols was initially discounted because there wasn't enough evidence for it and so on. And now what do we find? We find that over a period of time that the consensus has shifted exactly in the other direction. And ironically, it has led to, in this country at any rate, an outbreak of what military historians always say about military establishments, that they are always fighting the last war. So institutions in Britain which are trying to reopen and trying to be as responsible as possible, they're obsessed with cleaning surfaces, and they're still not up to speed on aerosol transmission. And so I suppose the point I was really trying to make was that when you start looking at a particular example of something for a threat for which reliable scientific knowledge is clearly the only rational way forward, it's not entirely straightforward in the public mind. That's entirely sensible. And then you have the next bit of it, which is, in the UK at any rate, the spectacularly incompetent government that we have at the moment insisted at the beginning that everything they did was led by the science, quotes unquote. And that seemed unlikely given the way they were behaving. But in any rate, that was the protestation was, we are led by the science. Well, then some very strange things happened as a result. Some of you may remember that there was a brief period of madness at the beginning of the pandemic here, where for 2 or 3 days, the government scientific advisors were advocating a kind of absolutely lunatic herd immunity strategy for 3 or 4 days. And then there was a panic-stricken weekend in which modelers at Imperial College decided, alarmed by this, started to run the simulations in order to see. But the strange thing for me was that I'm not an epidemiologist. I am numerate. And if you took the herd immunity idea seriously, then you only required a pocket calculator to work out how many deaths that would involve. So you didn't have to be, you really did not have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this was nonsense. And yet for 2 or 3 days, Sir Patrick Vallance and the others were solemnly intoning this. And then later on claiming that they hadn't. But they had. So if you're a detached observer, you're sitting there thinking, what is actually going on here with these people? And then another example yesterday, which is that there's been a resurgence of the virus in Ireland, as there is in most countries at the moment. And the Irish government has a scientific advisory body. And on Friday, I think, certainly a few days ago, this body decided that actually, given what was happening, that the rational thing to do would be to take the country to a stage 5 lockdown. That's as severe as it gets. That was their scientific advice. The government met in a full-day cabinet meeting yesterday and decided that, well, no, we'll just go to stage 3 with a few tweaks. Now, that's an interesting case where you have to acknowledge that you can't be led by the science in things like this. You can be advised by it, but you can't be led by it. And in the end, these kinds of decisions have to be made by politicians. And that's indeed exactly what happened. And there's an interesting contrast between that and the last big crisis in Britain, which was the one caused by BSE, when during the Blair government, when in that case, Tony Blair basically turned over the running of the country to his chief scientific advisor, and hundreds of thousands of animals were slaughtered, and so on. This guy this scientist ran the country for the best part of 3 weeks. And in that case, Tony Blair was led by the science, and the consequences were that he abdicated, in a sense, his responsibility as a politician. So this is kind of complicated stuff, and I don't think there are any really clear, unequivocal guidelines ever in addressing this kind of this kind of issue. Another aspect of it was that Britain has an independent but highly secretive group of scientific advisors in relation to this stuff. It's called SAGE. And their deliberations are secret. Their advice is to ministers, and no doubt that's perfectly reasonable and possible. But some very eminent other scientists led by the former chief scientific advisor to the government who had run the BSE campaign, they decided that actually they needed to set up an independent body of also equally eminent and expert people, as far as I could see. And in certain respects, their deliberations were all in public, held on YouTube. And they were sometimes coming to, it seemed to me, to radically different policy ideas than the official secretive body. Now, what's interesting about that in relation to science and the understanding of it is that the thing that most lay people don't seem to me to understand about science is that it is an epistemology. It is a way of thinking. It's a way of regarding what is knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and so on. And the most important aspect of that in relation to almost any crisis is that in general, the only rational approach to it is to entertain and be open about the fact that there are serious doubts and uncertainties all the time. And I don't think, the problem is that public perceptions of science do not tolerate the idea of uncertainty or the fact that we can't say things with absolute definitely. I think that's a really serious sort of, it's a very serious obstacle in the way of expecting societies and citizens to accept the primacy of science in lots of areas. I wanted to put forward what I hope is a provocative proposition, which is that you really can't understand any social process or any social activity unless you understand its political economy. And that applies, it certainly applies to technology, and that certainly the technology that I study. I think actually it also applies to science. And it seems to me that many discussions of science with a capital S in the way in which it is framed in this particular cultural right ignore that. And what I mean by that is that one has to take a more realistic view of the way in which science operates in society. And one way of getting a glimpse of that is to understand its political economy. So, for example, one of the great discoveries of the pandemic, which I guess experts have always known, which is that there's no money in vaccines, basically, which is why, in general, pharmaceutical companies don't do much of it until there's a crisis. But there's a lot of money in other things. So the kinds of research that's done reflects the political and economic realities of the way in which these organizations operate. That doesn't mean that that these organizations are not full of highly ethical, very professional, rational, well-intentioned human beings. But sometimes, but in many cases, this stuff doesn't happen unless there's an economic model that validates it and that rewards it. And that's particularly the case in relation to network technology that we have, particularly social media companies and so on. So that when we're faced with the problem that we now have, which is an astonishing resurgence of, for example, conspiracy theories of all kinds, of misinformation and disinformation relating to the vaccine on social media. and these are because of the existence of social media and the change in our information ecosystem. These bits of misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and lies, and untruths and inaccuracies, they circulate more or less with the speed of light. So we have a much more intensely polluted public sphere than we were accustomed to in the past, with fewer gatekeepers, with less quality control, and so on. And so when we're confronted with particularly egregious examples of this, our response is to say to the gatekeepers of the social media companies, you simply cannot allow this stuff to be circulated on your platforms. And we are shocked and surprised when many times they say, it's not our job to make those kinds of judgments. In other words, and our response is to say, well, this is outrageous because any sensible, rational, ethical human being would not allow this stuff to be circulated and published. Why are they doing it? Well, you know why they're doing it. They're doing it because they're operating a corporation, and corporations are by nature sociopathic. They have interests of their own, and those interests are to maximize the profits and the value of the corporations for shareholders. And it just so happens that the business model for a number of these companies, which we now call surveillance capitalism, essentially has discovered that the things that lead to more user engagement, and for them user engagement represents more revenues rather than less revenue. That's why they do it. It isn't because they're evil. It isn't because they want the world to be consumed by the QAnon conspiracy theory or whatever. It's simply because they work in corporations and this is what corporations do. The point I'm trying to get at then is that we are often applying in these cases a kind of moral indignation which is fueled by a belief that corporations represent the ethics and ideals and values of those who work within them. Much of the time they don't. And if you want to understand it, you need again to understand the political economy of it. One of the things I think we've learned so far from this is that the right to science is important, but even when we have it established as a fully recognized human right, it might not achieve the objectives we hope for it. For example, I think in due course we will get a vaccine for this virus. But we might find when we do that we have a real problem persuading more than quite a small proportion of our populations to accept it. And the reason is partly because so much anti-vaccination propaganda circulates freely on social media. And that's the case where there's going to be a clash between aspirations that we have in relation to rights and governance. When they come into conflict with the political economies of the dominant parts of our media ecosystem. And I think what I was thinking as I was listening to the discussions that we've had so far is that I don't know what the I don't know what the boundary is between realism and cynicism in this area. And with that, I think I'll leave it. I'm really anxious to be disagreed with, because this is very gloomy stuff.